The most dangerous words are never shouted. They're whispered by someone who has nothing left to fear. The polished marble floor reflected the crystal chandelier above like a frozen lake, every beam of golden light stretching across the vast entrance hall of the Romano estate. No one moved. No one even seemed willing to breathe. The silence felt heavier than the carved oak walls surrounding them, heavier than the expensive paintings that had watched decades of whispered deals and impossible decisions. Grace Carter stood in the middle of the room wearing a simple black maid's uniform, her hands resting calmly at her sides. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't plead. She simply waited. Across from her stood Vincent Romano, a man whose reputation had crossed state lines long before he ever did. His tailored charcoal suit looked untouched despite the storm gathering behind his blue eyes. Every employee in the mansion knew that look. It was the look that usually ended conversations before they ever truly began. A small velvet box rested open on the Persian rug between them. Its contents were gone. Nobody knew how it had disappeared. Nobody questioned why the entire household had been summoned within minutes. They only knew that whatever had been inside that box mattered enough to turn the air itself into ice. Vincent slowly stepped closer, his polished Italian shoes making almost no sound against the marble. His voice remained controlled, almost gentle, which somehow made every word feel even colder. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Around them, housekeepers exchanged frightened glances without daring to raise their heads. The head butler quietly closed his eyes as if already mourning what was about to happen. Even the security staff avoided looking directly at Grace. They had seen powerful people lose everything for far less. Yet Grace remained perfectly still. Her breathing never changed. Her shoulders never trembled. The expensive grandfather clock at the far end of the hall ticked once, twice, then a third time. Vincent's expression hardened. "Careful," he said softly. "Your next sentence may define the rest of your life." The warning echoed through the room before disappearing into another unbearable silence. Anyone else would have apologized. Anyone else would have begged for another chance. Anyone else would have searched desperately for someone else to blame. Grace did none of those things. Instead, she slowly lifted her eyes until they met Vincent's. For the first time since she had arrived at the Romano estate 3 months earlier, she looked directly into the face of the man everyone else feared. There was no anger in her expression, no challenge, only a strange sadness that seemed completely out of place inside a mansion built on wealth, influence, and unquestioned authority. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the ticking clock. "Mr. Romano, if you already decided who I am before asking what happened, then the missing item isn't the greatest thing you've lost today." The words drifted across the room almost weightlessly. Nobody reacted at first. It was as though every person present needed a moment to understand what they had just heard. Vincent's confident posture changed almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened. The certainty behind his eyes flickered. For a brief second, the room watched something almost impossible happen. The man who had spent his life questioning everyone suddenly found himself questioning his own judgment. No one dared interrupt the silence that followed. Even the chandelier seemed to glow more quietly. Somewhere outside, rain began tapping gently against the towering windows. Grace never looked away. Vincent never answered. And for reasons none of them yet understood, the missing velvet box no longer felt like the most important mystery inside the Romano mansion. 3 months earlier, Grace Carter stepped through the iron gates of the Romano estate carrying nothing more than a weathered duffel bag, a neatly folded employment letter, and a quiet determination that had survived far more difficult roads than the winding driveway before her. The mansion rose above the surrounding hills like a monument to power, its limestone walls glowing beneath the early morning sun, while fountains scattered diamonds across the air. Every inch of the property seemed designed to remind visitors exactly who owned it. Grace noticed the beauty, but she was more interested in the people. The groundskeeper nodded politely without smiling. 2 security officers exchanged careful glances before opening the front doors. Inside, every employee spoke in lowered voices as though the house itself listened. Sophia Reynolds, the head housekeeper, greeted Grace with professional courtesy and handed her a pressed black uniform. "There are 3 rules," Sophia said calmly. "Respect the house. Respect the schedule. Never make yourself noticeable." Grace accepted the uniform with a gentle smile. I understand. Sophia studied her for a moment longer. Most new employees arrived full of questions. Grace asked none. She simply listened, memorized every instruction, and began working before the clock struck 8. Within days, the other staff noticed something unusual. Grace never rushed, yet she was always finished first. She polished antique furniture without leaving a fingerprint. She arranged fresh flowers so naturally that visitors assumed they had always been there. She remembered every employee's name after hearing it only once. More surprising than her skill was her calm. Deliveries arrived late. Electricians interrupted routines. Guests changed plans without warning. Everyone else became anxious. Grace never did. She moved through every unexpected moment with the same quiet confidence she carried on her first morning. At lunch, she often sat alone near the kitchen window with a simple sandwich and a worn paperback book whose cover had nearly faded away. Nobody knew what she was reading because she always closed it before anyone came close. She rarely spoke about herself. When coworkers asked where she had lived before Chicago, she simply answered, several places. When they asked about family, she smiled politely and changed the subject. Rumors quickly replaced facts. Some believed she had worked for wealthy families on the East Coast. Others guessed she had once been a teacher. A few insisted she had survived something terrible because no ordinary person carried that kind of silence without a reason. Grace never confirmed or denied any story. She simply kept working. Every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, Vincent Romano crossed the main hallway on his way to his private office. Employees instinctively stepped aside without lifting their eyes. Grace did the same during her first week, but unlike everyone else, she did not appear frightened. She appeared respectful. There was a difference, subtle but impossible to ignore. Vincent noticed it before anyone realized he was paying attention. He said nothing. He simply continued walking while filing away another quiet observation. Days turned into weeks, and Grace became almost invisible within the rhythm of the estate. Yet strange moments kept drawing attention back to her. A frightened young server accidentally dropped an expensive crystal glass during a formal dinner. Before panic could spread, Grace calmly helped gather the broken pieces, reassured the trembling employee, and restored order so smoothly that several guests never realized anything had happened. Another morning, an elderly gardener struggled to carry heavy flower pots across the courtyard. Without announcing herself, Grace lifted one beside him and matched his pace until every planter had been placed exactly where he wanted. She accepted his grateful smile as though kindness required no acknowledgement. The mansion had seen hundreds of employees pass through its halls, but none had unsettled its routines by remaining so quietly composed. And somewhere behind the closed doors of his office, Vincent Romano found himself reviewing security reports that mentioned her name far more often than they should have for someone whose greatest talent seemed to be leaving almost no trace at all. Vincent Romano had built his life on one belief that had never failed him before. Every person revealed their true character when confronted with pressure. Wealth exposed greed. Authority exposed pride. Fear exposed dishonesty. He trusted that principle more than any contract or promise because it had protected him for years. Yet there was one person inside his own estate who refused to fit the pattern. Grace Carter remained exactly the same no matter what surrounded her. The realization bothered him far more than he cared to admit. It began with small observations. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, the power briefly failed across part of the mansion, while several important guests were expected within the hour. Employees rushed through the hallways trying to restore order before anyone noticed the disruption. Voices grew louder. Tempers became shorter. Grace quietly gathered candles from the storage room, arranged them throughout the reception area, and continued polishing the grand staircase as though the temporary darkness had been part of the original design. By the time the lights returned, the guests complimented the atmosphere without realizing anything unusual had happened. Vincent watched everything from the balcony outside his office. She had solved a problem before anyone asked her to. More importantly, she had done it without asking for recognition. A week later, he decided to test her without revealing his intentions. He instructed Sophia Reynolds to assign Grace impossible schedules that forced her to clean opposite ends of the estate within the same hour. Other employees quietly predicted she would complain before lunchtime. She never did. Instead, she reorganized her routine, helped two co-workers finish their assignments first, and somehow completed every task before sunset. When Sophia later apologized for the overwhelming workload, Grace simply answered, "Some days ask more from us than others. Tomorrow might ask less." Sophia repeated those words during the weekly staff meeting, and Vincent happened to overhear them while walking past the open doorway. He said nothing, but the sentence remained with him longer than he expected. Another opportunity appeared during a charity dinner held inside the mansion. More than 80 guests filled the ballroom with polished laughter, expensive watches, and conversations about business, politics, and investments. Grace moved quietly between tables carrying silver trays while remaining almost invisible. Near the end of the evening, an influential guest accidentally spilled coffee across a stack of important presentation folders. Embarrassment immediately spread across the table. Before anyone could assign blame, Grace calmly placed clean linen over the damaged papers, separated the dry pages from the wet ones, and quietly suggested making digital copies from the originals stored in the office. Her practical solution rescued the evening without embarrassing the guest further. Vincent noticed something unexpected. She always protected other people's dignity before protecting her own. That pattern became impossible to ignore. Curious, he ordered the security department to conduct a routine background review. The report arrived 48 hours later inside a plain envelope. It contained almost nothing unusual. Grace Carter, 30 years old. No criminal history. Steady employment records with long gaps that had simple explanations but surprisingly few details. Excellent references from previous employers who described her with nearly identical words. Reliable, honest, calm. One handwritten note attached to the final page caught Vincent's attention. It came from an elderly woman who had once employed Grace for several years. It read, "If Miss Carter ever chooses to work for you, understand that loyalty cannot be purchased. It can only be deserved." Vincent read the sentence twice before placing the file inside his desk drawer. That evening he stood alone beside the tall library windows watching rain drift across the gardens below. Somewhere inside the mansion, Grace continued her work exactly as she had every other day, completely unaware that she had become the only person in the estate who challenged his instincts without raising her voice. For the first time in years, Vincent Romano found himself less interested in what someone had done and more interested in understanding why they never seemed afraid of losing anything at all. Autumn settled over the Romano estate with cool mornings that covered the gardens in silver mist, and as the weeks passed, Vincent Romano found himself paying attention to details that should have meant nothing. Grace Carter never hurried through the mansion, yet she was never late. She never competed for approval, yet the newest employees instinctively followed her example. Most unusual of all, she treated every person with exactly the same quiet respect. The executive chef received the same warm greeting as the overnight janitor. The delivery driver carrying heavy boxes heard the same sincere thank you as the distinguished attorney arriving for a private meeting. It was a consistency Vincent had rarely encountered in a world where respect was usually measured by influence. One crisp Saturday morning, he happened to cross paths with Grace in the estate library before sunrise. Golden light slipped through the tall windows, illuminating thousands of leather-bound books collected over generations. Grace stood on a wooden ladder carefully dusting the highest shelves. She climbed down the final step just as Vincent entered, holding an old hardcover whose spine had begun to loosen with age. "This edition should probably be restored before someone opens it again," she said gently while placing it on the nearby table. Vincent looked at the title. It was an out-of-print biography that few people even recognized. "You have read it?" he asked without thinking. Grace nodded once. "Years ago. Did you like it?" She smiled faintly. "It reminded me that power changes very little if wisdom does not grow beside it." Before Vincent could respond, she politely excused herself and continued toward the hallway carrying her cleaning supplies. He remained standing beside the forgotten book much longer than he intended. The sentence echoed in his thoughts with uncomfortable persistence. Over the following days, small pieces of Grace's past appeared almost by accident, never through grand confessions, but through quiet moments that most people overlooked. Sophia once discovered Grace repairing the torn sleeve of another employee's uniform instead of replacing it. The young maid thanked her and asked where she had learned to sew so well. Grace answered, Someone once taught me that taking care of what is damaged is sometimes more important than buying something new. She never explained who that someone had been. Another afternoon, the estate hosted a fundraising luncheon for a neighborhood literacy program. While rearranging chairs after the guests departed, Grace noticed several children's books left inside a donation box. She paused for only a moment, gently tracing one colorful cover before placing every book back into perfect order. A volunteer smiled and said, "You must have children." Grace's expression softened with a sadness that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "No," she answered quietly. "But every child deserves someone who believes in them." She returned to work before anyone could ask another question. Those brief moments created more questions than answers. Vincent reviewed every report available to him, but there remained unexplained gaps that no investigator had managed to fill. There were years accounted for only by changes of address and ordinary employment records. Nothing suggested deception, yet nothing fully explained the depth of composure she carried into every room. It was as though an entire chapter of her life existed beyond the reach of paperwork. Late one evening, Vincent looked through the security cameras after most employees had gone home. On one screen, Grace sat alone on a wooden bench overlooking the quiet gardens. She was not reading or using her phone. She simply watched the wind move through the maple trees with peaceful patience, as though silence itself had become an old companion. Vincent realized something that unsettled him more than any unanswered question. Grace Carter was not hiding from the world. She had simply learned long ago that some stories became stronger when they no longer needed to be explained. And for reasons he could not yet understand, that quiet mystery made her impossible to dismiss. The turning point arrived on an ordinary Thursday morning, the kind of quiet autumn day that usually disappeared without leaving a memory. Sunlight spilled across the polished floors of the Romano estate, while employees moved through familiar routines with practiced precision. Fresh flowers decorated the dining room. The kitchen prepared lunch for a small gathering of business guests. Outside, gardeners trimmed hedges into perfect lines. Nothing suggested that before noon the peaceful rhythm of the mansion would come to a complete stop. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Vincent Romano entered his private study to retrieve a small, velvet presentation box that rarely left the locked drawer of his mahogany desk. The box contained a family heirloom that had been passed from one generation to the next, valuable not because of its appearance, but because it represented a promise his late grandfather had once made. Vincent unlocked the drawer, reached inside, and froze. The drawer was empty. He searched the desk once, then twice, then a third time with growing disbelief. Within minutes, the security office received a direct order. Every entrance was secured. Every employee was asked to remain inside the estate until further notice. Conversations stopped. Footsteps echoed through the marble hallways. Staff members exchanged anxious looks while trying to understand what had happened. Sophia Reynolds gathered everyone inside the grand entrance hall, her normally steady voice carrying an unfamiliar tension. Vincent arrived moments later holding the empty velvet box in one hand. His expression revealed almost nothing, which somehow unsettled everyone even more. He slowly explained that the missing item held tremendous personal importance and asked whether anyone had seen the box or entered his office during the morning. One by one, employees quietly answered no. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody attempted to leave. Security officers respectfully began reviewing entry logs and camera footage while maintaining the calm professionalism expected inside the estate. At first, the recordings appeared ordinary. Housekeepers completed scheduled assignments. Gardeners worked outside. Delivery drivers remained under supervision. Then one brief camera angle changed everything. Grace Carter could be seen entering the hallway leading toward Vincent's office, carrying fresh linens. A few minutes later, she exited holding the same folded towels before continuing toward the library. Nothing about her behavior appeared unusual, yet the timing immediately attracted attention because no other employee had entered that section of the mansion during those minutes. One security supervisor quietly informed Vincent that the camera inside the office itself had been temporarily offline due to a scheduled software update earlier. That morning, the coincidence settled over the room like a heavy winter cloud. Nobody accused Grace directly, but dozens of silent eyes slowly turned toward her. She stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, hands folded neatly before her apron, her breathing calm despite the growing weight of suspicion surrounding her. Sophia immediately stepped forward. "There has to be another explanation," she said carefully. "Grace has never given us a reason to question her integrity." Another employee nodded in agreement, remembering countless moments when Grace had protected others without expecting recognition. Yet uncertainty spread through the hall because facts suddenly seemed to point in only one direction. Vincent looked from the security report to Grace with an expression that revealed an unfamiliar conflict. Every instinct he had trusted throughout his life urged him toward a quick conclusion. The evidence appeared simple. The opportunity existed. The unanswered questions multiplied by the second. Grace met his eyes without lowering her own. She did not defend herself. She did not interrupt. She simply waited while the silence between them grew so complete that even the steady ticking of the grandfather clock sounded impossibly loud. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, a cold breeze stirred the maple leaves across the estate, and inside the mansion, every person present sensed that whatever happened next would change far more than the search for a missing family heirloom. The silence inside the entrance hall stretched until it became almost tangible. Nobody dared whisper. Nobody shifted their feet. Every employee understood that the next few moments would determine far more than the fate of a missing heirloom. Vincent Romano slowly stepped away from the gathered staff, the empty velvet box still resting in his hand like an unanswered question. His measured footsteps echoed across the marble floor before he stopped only a few feet from Grace Carter. He studied her face with the same careful attention he reserved for complicated negotiations, searching for the smallest crack in her composure. Instead, he found only quiet patience. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable authority. "You were the last person recorded near my office before the heirloom disappeared. Tell me why." Grace answered without hesitation. "I replaced fresh towels in the guest hallway exactly as scheduled. After that, I returned to the library." Vincent continued watching her. "Did you enter my office?" "No, sir." "Did you touch this box?" "No, sir." Another long silence followed. The security supervisor quietly handed Vincent a printed report summarizing the timeline. Every detail seemed to tighten the circle around Grace. The cameras had captured no one else. The office recording had failed at precisely the wrong moment. Logic appeared to point in only one direction. Several employees lowered their heads, unable to watch what they believed was about to happen. Sophia Reynolds clasped her hands together, hoping Vincent would hesitate long enough for another explanation to emerge. Vincent took one slow breath before speaking again. "Do you understand how this appears?" Grace nodded gently. "Yes." "Then perhaps you also understand why trust becomes difficult." She met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried since her first day at the estate. "I understand why fear makes certainty feel comfortable." The sentence lingered in the room. Vincent narrowed his eyes slightly. "Are you suggesting I am acting out of fear?" Grace did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the tall windows where gray clouds drifted across the autumn sky before returning her attention to him. "I am suggesting that when people believe they have already found the truth, they often stop looking for it." A quiet murmur almost escaped from one of the younger employees before disappearing beneath another wave of silence. Vincent had spent years surrounded by people who either agreed with him immediately or avoided challenging him altogether. Grace had done neither. Still, he remained unconvinced. "You realize your situation leaves very little room for philosophy." Grace gave a faint, respectful nod. "Then allow me only one sentence, Mr. Romano." He folded his arms without replying. Grace's voice remained soft enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it clearly. "If you decide who I am before you discover what happened, then today you will lose something far more valuable than the heirloom you are searching for." No one moved. Even the ticking grandfather clock seemed to fade into the background. Vincent stared at her as though the room had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. The words contained no accusation, no anger, and no attempt to defend herself. They carried only an unsettling truth that reached beyond the missing object lying somewhere inside the estate. He remembered every quiet act of integrity he had witnessed during the past 3 months. He remembered the elderly woman's handwritten reference that loyalty had to be deserved rather than purchased. He remembered the library conversation about wisdom growing beside power. One sentence connected every memory into something he had not expected. For the first time since the search had begun, Vincent realized he was standing at a crossroads. One path required only confidence in the evidence already before him. The other demanded something far more difficult. It required the humility to consider that his first conclusion might be incomplete. Around them, the employees remained perfectly still, sensing that the atmosphere inside the Romano mansion had changed forever, not because the heirloom was still missing, but because one quiet maid had forced the most powerful man in the room to question the certainty he had trusted his entire life. No one expected Vincent Romano to speak the next words. The entire household remained frozen as he lowered his eyes from Grace Carter to the security report still resting in his hand. Several long seconds passed before he quietly folded the document and handed it back to the security supervisor. "Nobody leaves," he said evenly. "But nobody will be judged until every fact has been verified." A ripple of surprise spread through the room. Even Sophia Reynolds looked up in disbelief. Employees who had worked at the estate for years understood the significance of that decision. Vincent was known for making difficult choices quickly, yet this time he had chosen patience over certainty. Grace did not smile. She simply nodded once, as though she respected the decision without celebrating it. Within minutes, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted from accusation to investigation. Vincent personally ordered every security recording to be reviewed frame by frame instead of relying on summary reports. Maintenance records were retrieved. Digital access logs were compared against handwritten schedules. Deliveries were verified down to the minute. The process continued well into the evening, while the mansion settled into an uneasy silence. As the hours passed, tiny details that had seemed meaningless began connecting in unexpected ways. The software update that had interrupted the office camera had not started at the scheduled time listed in the report. It had begun nearly 12 minutes earlier than authorized. The technician responsible insisted he had followed the original work order, yet the electronic approval carried a timestamp that did not match the building management system. Vincent frowned as he studied the discrepancy. "Find out who changed this authorization," he instructed calmly. Another discovery followed. One of the interior hallway cameras had briefly captured the reflection of a maintenance cart parked near the service corridor. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then a security analyst enlarged the image and noticed that the cart was positioned in a location where no maintenance assignment had been scheduled. Someone had moved it there for less than 5 minutes before it disappeared again. Vincent watched the footage repeatedly without speaking. The pattern no longer pointed toward Grace. It suggested planning. Late that night, another breakthrough arrived. A junior security employee comparing key card activity noticed that one master service card had entered the administrative wing during the exact period when the office camera was offline. The card belonged to Daniel Mercer, the estate operations coordinator, a trusted employee who had worked for Vincent for nearly 8 years. Daniel's normal responsibilities allowed him access to nearly every section of the mansion, making his movements appear routine. Until now, no one had questioned them. Vincent requested Daniel's activity log for the previous month. Several irregular entries immediately appeared. Small schedule changes, unexpected maintenance requests, temporary camera interruptions that had never attracted attention because each one seemed isolated. Viewed together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Sophia quietly covered her mouth as realization settled over her. Grace was never the center of this, she whispered. She was only standing where someone expected suspicion to fall. Vincent remained silent. He remembered Grace's words about people stopping their search once they believed they had already found the truth. Those words no longer sounded philosophical. They sounded painfully practical. Near midnight, another security officer entered the library carrying a small evidence envelope discovered behind a storage cabinet in the maintenance workshop. Inside rested a replacement security seal identical to the ones used on Vincent's private office drawer. Someone had prepared carefully long before the heirloom disappeared. Vincent slowly closed the envelope and looked through the rain-covered windows into the darkness beyond the gardens. For the first time in many years, he recognized that the greatest danger had not been deception itself. It had been his willingness to accept the simplest explanation before earning the right to believe it. Upstairs, Grace quietly finished folding fresh linens exactly as she had every evening since arriving at the estate. completely unaware that the truth she had protected with nothing more than dignity and patience was finally beginning to reveal itself. The following morning, the Romano estate felt different. The tension that had gripped every hallway the day before had given way to a quieter kind of anticipation. Employees spoke in careful whispers, aware that the investigation had uncovered far more than anyone expected. Vincent Romano spent most of the morning inside his study reviewing the newest findings. But despite the growing evidence, one question refused to leave his mind. Why had Grace Carter remained so calm when nearly every circumstance had pointed against her? Shortly after noon, he asked Sophia Reynolds to invite Grace to the library. The room was peaceful, filled with warm afternoon light that filtered through towering windows and settled across rows of old books. Grace entered with the same composed expression she carried every day, gently closing the door behind her. Vincent stood beside the fireplace, holding the small notebook that investigators had recovered from the maintenance office. It contained schedule changes and access codes, confirming that someone else had carefully arranged the confusion surrounding the missing heirloom. He placed the notebook on a nearby table before speaking. "The investigation is changing direction," he said quietly. Grace nodded once. "I thought it might." Vincent looked at her with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. "There is something I still do not understand." She waited patiently. "Yesterday, when everyone believed you were responsible, you never tried to defend yourself. You never became angry. You never demanded that anyone believe you. What?" Grace lowered her eyes for a brief moment, not from fear, but from memory. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the gentle weight of someone opening a door that had remained closed for many years. "Because I learned a long time ago that panic rarely changes another person's mind. Character does." Vincent remained silent. Grace continued. "Many years ago, my father worked for a company where one mistake was blamed on the easiest person instead of the right person. He tried to explain, but no one wanted to hear explanations. They wanted certainty. He lost his job before the truth was discovered." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the shelves lined with history and philosophy. Several weeks later, they admitted he had been innocent. They apologized. They even offered his position back. Vincent quietly asked, "Did he return?" Grace slowly shook her head. "He told me something I have never forgotten. He said, 'A broken reputation can be repaired, but a careless judgment changes everyone involved.'" The room became still again. He was not angry. Grace continued. He simply decided that no one else would ever have the power to decide his worth. Before he knew it himself. "I have tried to live the same way." Vincent listened without interrupting. For the first time, he realized that Grace's confidence had never come from believing life would always be fair. It came from surviving moments when fairness had arrived too late to erase the damage. "So when everyone looked at you yesterday," he began. Grace finished the thought with a peaceful smile. "I knew that if I allowed fear to become louder than truth, then I would lose something far more important than my job." Vincent slowly looked away toward the rain beginning to fall outside the windows. He remembered every decision he had made throughout his career based on instinct alone. Most had served him well. But instinct without humility had nearly led him to repeat the same mistake that had shaped another family's life years earlier. Grace gently reached for the notebook on the table and slid it back toward him. "Mr. Romano," she said softly, "people become stronger when they are trusted, but leaders become wiser when they are willing to question themselves." Vincent did not answer immediately. He simply stood there in thoughtful silence, understanding that the woman everyone had underestimated had never been protected by luck. She had been guided by a lesson about dignity that no accusation, no misunderstanding, and no powerful opinion had ever managed to take away from her. 2 days later, the investigation reached its quiet conclusion. Hidden behind a removable panel inside an unused maintenance cabinet, the missing family heirloom was recovered exactly as the investigators had begun to suspect. Additional records confirmed that Daniel Mercer had carefully manipulated schedules, maintenance requests, and security interruptions over several weeks to conceal his actions and redirect attention towards someone whose calm nature made her an easy target for assumptions. The truth arrived without celebration. It simply stood where false certainty had once stood. Vincent Romano instructed that every employee gather once more inside the grand entrance hall where the misunderstanding had begun. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows, washing the marble floor in warm gold instead of cold gray. The atmosphere felt entirely different. Nobody whispered this time. They waited. Grace Carter stood near the back of the room exactly as she always had, making no attempt to place herself at the center of attention. Sophia Reynolds offered her a gentle smile that Grace returned with quiet kindness. Vincent stepped forward holding the restored velvet box in both hands. He looked around the room before allowing his eyes to settle on Grace. There was no trace of pride in his expression, only honesty. "The investigation is complete," he said calmly. "The heirloom has been recovered, and Miss Carter had no involvement in its disappearance." Relief swept across the room. Several employees smiled openly. Others lowered their heads, remembering how quickly suspicion had spread only days earlier. Vincent continued speaking before anyone else could respond. Facts corrected the mistake, but facts alone cannot repair what assumptions almost destroyed. The words hung in the air with unusual weight. Slowly, Vincent walked across the marble floor until he stood directly before Grace. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Every person present understood they were witnessing something none of them had expected. Vincent Romano extended the velvet box to Sophia before turning back toward Grace. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I allowed incomplete evidence to become complete certainty. Although I chose to continue the investigation, I should never have allowed doubt to replace fairness. For that, I sincerely apologize." The room fell completely silent. No employee could remember ever hearing Vincent offer a public apology to anyone. Grace looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried from her first day inside the estate. She answered softly, "Thank you for choosing the truth before it was too late." Vincent nodded. "You reminded me that leadership is not measured by how quickly decisions are made, but by the willingness to question them." Grace smiled gently. "Then perhaps we both learned something valuable." A quiet warmth spread through the room. The tension that had haunted the mansion for days finally dissolved into something far more lasting than relief. In the weeks that followed, small changes appeared throughout the Romano estate. Security procedures became more transparent. Employees were encouraged to speak before conclusions were reached. Vincent spent more time listening than giving instructions. The atmosphere inside the mansion gradually transformed, not because the walls had changed, but because the people within them had. Grace returned to her ordinary routine without asking for recognition. She polished antique furniture, arranged fresh flowers, helped new employees find confidence, and continued reading her worn paperback during quiet lunch breaks by the kitchen window. Nothing about her outward life appeared different. Yet everyone who worked beside her understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. She had never defeated authority with anger. She had never demanded respect through fear. She had simply refused to surrender her dignity while waiting for the truth to arrive. Months later, visitors often admired the beauty of the Romano estate without realizing its greatest treasure had never been hidden inside a velvet box. It had been revealed in the quiet courage of one woman who understood that character remains steady even when circumstances do not. And on that unforgettable autumn morning, Vincent Romano finally discovered that true strength does not begin when others fear you. It begins the moment you have the humility to question yourself. And that day, everyone inside the Romano mansion remembered what dignity truly looked like.